And Talent Management Committee meeting is called to order. And let's start with the roll call, please.
Teresa Taylor,
Here.
Irena Ortega,
She's coming.
Rob Fechner,
Good afternoon.
Matthew Saha for Fiona Ma, Lisa Middleton, Stacy Oliveris, Mona Pasquil Rogers.
All right. Our second order of business is the action consent items, which is the approval of the February 20th, 2019 PCTM committee closed session meeting minutes. Moved by Ms. Pascal Rogers. Second by Ms. Middleton. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? All right. Motion passes. Action agenda item 3A, review of the performance compensation chief executive officer, Ms. Campbell.
I think we're out of order. Right?
I'm looking at am I looking at closed
Yeah, that was
session or
closed.
open session?
That was closed.
I'm looking at closed, my bad, sorry. I'm sorry. Executive report, Mr. Hoffner.
Thank you. Doug Hoffner, CalPERS team member. Today we have several items before you today. Agenda item 4B is the action consent seeking approval of proposed revisions to the board's compensation policy for executive and investment management positions. There's a red line document in your materials, as well as we did sort of a synopsis of the changes. This brings into effect essentially the changes the board has approved in the last sort of 6 months, including adding several positions to the descriptions of the comp policy. There's some tax statements in there from our outside tax counsel, as well as some other revisions from an administrative perspective we're looking to get approval for. This does not include anything to do with long-term incentives, because that has not been approved by the board. So any action you take today would need to be incorporated into policy provisions later on. But just want to clarify, there's nothing related to long-term care in that policy at the moment. In addition, we have several other items for action. 6A is an action item to look at the CEO's annual appraisal and results of your closed session discussion. 6B is discussion about a request for proposal for the board's primary incentive comp consultant. The contract the board currently has with Grant Thornton and comes to an end in the fall of 2020, and we just want to tee up for you a RFP process that we would go through, mirroring what we did nearly 4.5 years ago when the board selected them as the consultant. And then 6C, it's a recommendation from the board's incentive comp consultant on salaries and incentive ranges for a deputy chief investment officer position, as well as a revised salary range for the general counsel position. And then finally, 6D is the second reading of the long-term incentive program brought to you by your board's incentive comp consultant, Grant Thornton. And that concludes my report, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hoffner. All right, now we are on action consent items. So we're moving the approval of the Performance Compensation Talent Management Committee meeting minutes and the proposed revision to the board's compensation policy for executive and investment management. What's the committee direction? Action consent items. Okay, moved by Mr. Fechner, second by Ms. Oliveris. Ms. Pascal Rogers. Okay, all those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Okay. Abstain for you? You right now, are you? I said aye. Aye, okay. Action passes. We're moving on to 5 information consent items. I don't believe we had anything pulled off. Draft agenda for the next, okay. So then we're going on to 6, agenda item 6A. And I think that is Tina.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Tina Campbell, CalPERS team member. The board's compensation policy for executive and investment management positions requires an annual review. Did you say 6A, right? Okay. Annual review of performance for the CEO. Agenda item 6A is an action item resulting from committee's closed session evaluation of the CEO's fiscal year 18-19 performance. All members of the board were encouraged to participate in the committee's performance discussion. Based on the performance ratings determined in closed session by the committee and the incentive metric outcomes, the resulting incentive fiscal year 18-19 award for the CEO is $94,340, or 28.5%. And then we need a motion.
Okay. All right, I will entertain a motion for the monetary compensation for the CEO of $94,340 or 28.5%. It was moved by Ms. Pascal Rogers. Second by Mr. Fechner. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? All right, motion passes.
Okay. And then
6C.
Based on the committee's closed session performance review of the CEO, the subsequent salary increase for fiscal year 1920 is 2%, resulting in a new base salary of $337,334.
$334?
Mm-hmm.
$4.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, I will entertain a motion for the base salary increase to $330,334.
It's $337,000.
$337,334. Did I read that wrong? I wrote it down right. Okay. Moved by Mr. Fechner. Second by Ms. Middleton. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Okay, and I think we are on what, 6C?
B.
B. So primary compensation consultant. That's right. Okay, go ahead. 6B.
Okay. Tina Campbell, CalPERS team member. This action item seeks the compensation's approval to proceed with the development of a request for proposal for the board's primary compensation consultant. Currently, Grant Thornton fills this role for the board, and they were selected through a competitive process in 2015 for a 5-year contract, which expires November 2020. We're bringing this item to you today to allow for the appropriate amount of time to develop an RFP and conduct the competitive selection process for a new contract to be in place around the same time the current contract expires. If the committee approves the development of this RFP, we'll return at our next meeting with more details on services, timeline, and the competitive selection process, including how a subcommittee for this committee will be involved in the process. Thank you, members of the committee. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from the committee members? Okay, I will entertain a motion for starting the RFP process for our consultant. Moved by Ms. Middleton. Second by Ms. Oliveras. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right. The motion carries. We're moving on. And we are on 6C now.
Tina Campbell, CalPERS team member. This action item seeks the committee's approval for salary and incentive ranges for the Deputy Chief Investment Officer position and a revised salary range for the General Counsel position. As you're aware, the Investment Office plans to transition to an organizational structure which includes the addition of a Deputy Chief Investment Officer, a classification for which CalPERS has received approval to borrow from CalSTRS. This structure will enable our Chief Investment Officer to place more focused time and attention to the most strategic and critical investment decisions by transferring key day-to-day responsibilities to the Deputy Chief Investment Officer role. In regard to the General Counsel, this is one of 2 remaining positions which have not yet been reviewed for compensation adjustments to align with market data and the pay philosophy adopted by the board for other covered positions over the last several meetings. The incumbent in this position has not received any base increase in the last 2 years since he is at the max of the salary range. Eric Gonzaga of Grant Thornton is here to present the base pay and incentive range recommendations for these positions, and with that, I'll turn it over to him unless you have questions for me.
I do have a question from Ms. Ortega.
No, I can wait.
Oh, you can wait?
Yeah, I'll wait till the presentation.
All right, push your button again then. Okay, go ahead.
So consistent with, for both positions, consistent with the philosophy of, how the organization has historically benchmarked, we utilized, the same peers. And the proposal for, the deputy CIO is really one that, positions pay halfway between the CIO and the managing directors. And it essentially is reflective of the same market positioning as for the other individuals, which targets 50th percentile total cash of the marketplace. As for the general counsel, same methodology, utilizing data that was collated approximately 5 years ago. And it was aged, by conservative 3% over the last 5 years. And it does certainly indicate, the need for, movement in the range. And that is what that reflects, again, consistent with that 50th percentile total cash philosophy. So.
Okay. So it's in between, I just had a quick question and then I'm going to turn it over to my vice chair. It's in between our COIO and our chief investment officer? Is that, you're saying mid-range? Is that what I'm getting here? Eric or Doug?
Yes, the CIO.
The chief investment officer and the managing investment director roles.
Managing
the
investment director.
COIO role is actually has a lower salary than the MIDs.
Okay. Okay. And then I think one of my concerns was we want to create 3 of these positions, but we're going to do it at net zero, basically. So I want to know how, there's such high-paying positions, how do we get rid of or take over positions? How many positions are we looking at using to defray those costs?
As far as the exact number of positions, I don't think that's been completely determined yet, depending on how we bring them up and when we bring them up. We had mentioned several times before about position pooling, and so there may be some resources there that we'll be using, but it is the net zero means that we will not be using brand new positions or new money.
Okay, so what is position pooling? I don't understand that.
Yeah. So position pooling, we've talked about this a couple times, and it's really about every time there's a vacancy in the organization, whether it's an investment office or anywhere else, we look at the position to see if we still need it. And if we no longer need it, it goes to the executive team with our CEO to look at for where in the organization we may need it. And we do have a handful of positions in there now. And we're actually going through that next iteration to see if there are more positions that aren't needed in certain places within the organization, and that's going to be happening within the next month.
So, and I just want to, in my view, I think this is a great way to move our investment office. So I don't necessarily think it has to be cost neutral. If we need to spend money on this, I'm not adverse to that, but that's entirely up to the board. I just wanted to bring that up. I know that we're looking at the position pooling, but anyway, Ms. Ortega.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little more about the determination of whether there would be 1 or 3 or sort of how that might come forward. And I think I don't necessarily agree with the Ms. Taylor's comment about the money being neutral. That would be nice. But I think I have a more of an interest in what does the organizational structure look like. So there's a discussion about day-to-day tasks moving down. As I see it now, without a change in organizational structure, you're just adding another layer in the org chart. Even if you're taking positions from somewhere else to do it on a fiscally neutral basis, you might be taking a position from another division to do that fiscally neutral. That to me is less of the issue than what is the organizational structure, where are the duties lying, do we really need 3 of these positions, and if so, what layers of other management in the division are coming out?
Mr. Hoffner or Ms. Frost?
So we're not completely certain what the final organizational structure would be. Part of it would be to get started with recruitment of 1 deputy CIO, and then make a determination whether we needed to recruit, position 2 and position 3. But we have done some sketching out of what that structure could look like. Potentially, it could be up to 3, but it doesn't have to be 3. But at this point in time, what we're asking is approval to have the deputy chief investment officer at CalPERS, and then we come back to you as we are refining the structure.
Okay. Ms. Oliveris?
I had some questions about the compensation ranges. I guess this is for Arkansas. So I understand this is some type of a midpoint between the CIO and the MID positions. How does this compare to private sector?
Consistent with the rest, it would be quite a bit below. If you're taking a look specifically at all in, because the targeted philosophy is 50th percentile total cash compensation. Okay. And in industry, they tend to have long-term incentives as well, particularly for a position this senior. And so there certainly would be a significant lag relative to industry, but if you're only taking a look at the competitive salary plus annual incentive relative to industry, it would be in line. However, without the long-term incentives, it would be below market. So,
How much below?
Without having the numbers in front of me, probably 30-40% low.
And how do you weight civil service being part of this too? Do you add that as almost like an insurance factor, right? So you might not have all the upside in terms of equity, but you have more job security. How does that weigh into it?
It weighs in quite a bit with the perspective, and not just it being civil service, but the mission of the organization certainly isn't, although you're competing for talent with other entrepreneurial organizations, this is a mission-driven organization, and so there's an expectation that there will be a discount relative to industry. And so the philosophy that you've adopted certainly reflects that, and where there is a significant discount relative to industry. And so, the issue comes down to, are we paying competitively enough, recognizing things such as the culture, the mission, and the security, although not being so far below industry that you won't be able to recruit, retain the types of folks you want from industry. So it has a significant bearing by the inherently below market philosophy that you've adopted.
So would it be that gap then of, say, 40 to the 50%, and you're saying the assurance that's additional, I would say, job security that comes from being a civil servant then makes up for that gap between 40?
It certainly is one of the considerations that, the fact that this isn't, for just as an example, for many investment positions, it is certainly you can make sometimes twice the dollars, maybe 3 times the dollars that CalPERS is paying, based on good performance years. However, this is a mission-driven government organization. You don't have to raise your own funds necessarily, and so it's all of the factors in addition to the protections of being part of civil service that equate to allowing that discount. So,
Thank you.
All right. Ms. Pascal Rogers?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So I want to just touch upon a little bit more about what Arena's question was, and that is an org chart. And I think that I agree and I support, a chief deputy, because I think a good chief deputy actually allows the team to, and the primary to really get what needs to be done. But just in my experience, I think, and especially knowing the investment world and this department and how there are a lot of eyes on the department. We help the department by, having an org chart proposed. So it could be draft day. We won't really just want to work on the chief deputy, but, we look much more thoughtful and wise if we can provide to the board, what it would look like. Okay, Marcy, thank you.
I mean, I can share the early thinking, and he's looking at, if more of his time is being spent on the investment portfolio and developing the team, that you would have potentially a deputy over public markets, a deputy over private markets, and potentially the what's currently the COIO could become a deputy level position, potentially, depending on recruitment and what we might need. But that's early ideas, but we do know that he needs one deputy CIO more immediately than the other two.
I get it, but you understand what I mean?
I do. I completely understand it.
Sorry,
I lost you.
Sorry.
Hold on. All right. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just, in terms of the people that we serve, we look better that way, and I think that we serve the team better if we are, plans can change, but we need to be prepared to think about questions like the director of Cal HR asks. Thank you.
All right.
One more point, if I can add.
Yes, Ms.
Is
Campbell.
that the CIO currently has, it's either 8 or 9 direct reports. So just from a span control, that's a lot. So
Right.
that's another consideration when we're looking at these positions.
Right, and I think that was one of the things that Ben talked to us about yesterday, was that he has a lot of direct reports, and his hands are in day-to-day business, and that's what we're trying to relieve here. So on that, I think if we can get, I'd like to direct the staff to give us a kind of an org chart and give us an idea of what positions are being used to fund this, at least this one position we're for sure looking to hire for right now. But I think Ms. Ortega is looking for some sort of organizational chart, so we're not just having repetitive positions. So if we could get that. And then I would like to entertain a motion for the salary and incentive ranges for the Deputy Chief Investment Officer and General Counsel, which we didn't, I don't know that Ms. Campbell got to. Did you want to cover that? We didn't get to.
Mr. Gonzaga will actually cover
Okay,
that as
Mr.
well.
Gonzaga.
And, I did cover that a little bit in the commentary, but the methodology is the exact same as for, the deputy CIO. Same peer group as we've used historically for
Okay.
the other positions. And, certainly when we take a look at the data, the proposed adjustment to the salary range, it still keeps it well within market practices and consistent with the historical philosophy.
Okay, great. Okay, so I will entertain a motion for both those salary and incentive ranges. Anybody? Moved by Ms. Middleton, seconded by Ms. Pasquale Rogers. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? All right, motion carries. Ms. Brown, I'm sorry, Ms. Brown, I didn't see you till just now.
Okay. Thank you for calling on me after the vote. I just wanted to, again, agree with Ms. Ortega that I have concerns that we might be adding a whole nother layer of top management and with the MIDs, because but in addition to the org chart, I'd like to see how the roles would change, what the roles and reporting responsibilities are. Because right now, I think the MIDs have support or supervision over those asset classes. So I would like to know how that's going to work. And then I did have a question about the new compensation for the general counsel. Does that mean that our existing general counsel, that would go into effect for our existing general counsel? Would that only go into effect if we do a new hire?
So as I understand it, I believe this has to do with our existing general counsel being at the top of his range. Is that correct? So we're just
That's right.
increasing the pay
That's right.
range.
I'm asking staff. So
Yeah, it's the policy that's been proposed that's here is for the incumbent. It would be applicable for anybody else. The issue would be he's at the top of the range today. Should he have the opportunity for a pay increase? That's the performance question to come. So this is talking about the salary range itself, and then how that performance of that position is separate. So they're two distinct things.
So it's just the salary range, not the performance.
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, it looks like we are moving on to 6D, long-term incentive program design. So that's Mr. Gonzaga.
Thank you. And I actually am, we're going to go over a couple different sections. One is just a refresher on, how we got here. And, certainly there's some redundancy between this presentation and the last one. However, just discussion of the background, which Mr. Mishka will lead, and then we'll go into the recommendations.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you guys. And so I thought first we'd go through some of the key definitions so everybody's kind of consistent with the terminology that we'll use throughout today, as well as part of that, discuss some of our suggestions and recommendations on some of the key plan policies. And then we'll get into recommendations of what you guys had asked us back in June to come back with today. So as we go through, we'll see CAGR, which is really just the compounded annual growth rate, and that's really going to be set equal to the kind of total fund returns, and that'll be used to measure performance through the 5-year performance period. How we use CAGR is it kind of smooths out any large swings year to year. The expected rate of return, again, will be what the actuarial assumption is for the year in year 1 of the 5-year performance period, and that will set the target goal. So for example, if CalPERS' expected rate of return is 7%, in year 1, then that would become the goal, or 7% would become the goal for the next 5 years. Moving on, the initial LTIP value. Again, this is going to be a 5-year performance period, and that first value is going to be set equal to the lower of a participant's annual incentive target or the actual bonus that was received in that year. And then that value can increase or decrease depending on the performance over that 5-year period. That increase or decrease is set based upon a payout multiplier, and that's going to be 0 to 150% depending on performance. And over that performance period of 5 years. And then the total fund returns is going to be measured using the net time-weighted rate of return of the total fund performance over that 5-year period. So one way to think about it would be the actuarial assumptions for setting the goal. That methodology would be used the same to set what the actual performance was over that 5-year period. So back in February of 2019, just as a refresher, the committee had agreed to increase base salaries, midpoints for the ranges to the between the market 50th and market 75th percentiles. We also adjusted the consolidated annual incentive ranges, and then finally introduced a long-term incentive plan with the goal to get compensation between these three base salary, annual incentives, and this long-term incentive component to be competitive with the market total cash 50th percentile. And then back in June, we had proposed a structure for the long-term incentive program. We discussed the threshold target maximum performance levels for the total fund returns and how that could play out in terms of long-term incentive payouts. And you guys asked us to come back with another model or scenario for you to consider. And that's what we're here today to discuss, is really that threshold level, or what that threshold level should look like in terms of when payouts will occur. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Gonzaga.
Great. So, relative to our plan recommendations, again, just to drive it home, this is based on absolute total fund returns as measured over a 5-year period. So it equates to how the fund performs on an absolute basis, on a forward-looking basis, essentially, CAGR over that 5-year period. The goal, it does require an element of goal setting, and just to align with the expectations of this organization, the goal would be, the target goal, regardless, the solid expected level of stretch performance would be based on the actuarial assumption. In today's date, it's at 7%. So in order to achieve target award, you'd have to achieve CAGR of 7% over that 5-year period on an absolute basis. Now, the opportunity levels are linked with how the annual incentive plan is administered, in that the target opportunity is going to be the lower of the target opportunities that you'll see on the subsequent page, or the most recent annual incentive award that's linked directly to relative to returns, looking on a backward looking basis. So it'll be the lower of those two. You'll provide a long-term incentive plan opportunity for every 5-year period, with a new 5-year period starting, every year. It encourages, appropriate pay for performance. There's always the potential for dealing with retention issues from the standpoint that there's always something if somebody chooses to leave the organization. The amounts that are not yet, if the performance period isn't done yet, that individual will forfeit the opportunity for that 5-year award. And also, there's a range of opportunity, anywhere from 0 up to 150% of whatever the target value is for that performance period. So there's an ability to recognize performance, both, you get nothing. If it's below expectations, you can earn. There is some significant upside, but it's not such huge upside, such that it encourages any sort of risky, excessive risk taking, where you can achieve award up to 150% of that specific target long-term incentive opportunity. Now, on page 11, what you'll find is just the proposed long-term incentive opportunities. They're essentially comparable to the annual incentive opportunities, with the whole point being that we always want to encourage appropriate balance between annual and long-term performance, and hence the opportunities are the same. And if you go to page 12, this really gets into the plan construct. When we had this conversation, a couple months back, the issue was, well, if we're expecting 7% over the next on average, and that's the actuarial assumption, for all three options that you have in front of you, target, so the expected level of award for good stretch performance, is set at 7%. If you get to that 7% CAGR over a 5-year period, it would pay out at the expected or target levels under the pay plan. And so with that, with target annual incentive and with salary positioned at the midpoint, you would be achieving that 50th percentile total cash compensation level. Not total direct, specifically total cash compensation. Now, the upside in all three is the same as well. Typically, you provide some element of upside based on performance. And, we put the maximums under all three opportunities, getting to 120% of target. Pretty common to provide maximum bonuses for exceeding target by 20%. And it would cap out at 150% award of target. Finally, there's threshold. It's pretty commonplace for plans to provide payouts in the event of performance that's a little bit below target, recognizing that goal setting is, there's some art to it. And just to encourage always that incentive for the sustained period, it's common to have thresholds. Our recommendation is, option A, because that's consistent with, what this committee wanted going forward, which is we're only going to pay target awards if we achieve target. And that's where, option A, there is no threshold. Option B and C are these are pretty common features whereby, you provide a little bit of latitude underneath target, and they would pay out at 50% of target to the extent that it's meaningful performance, not quite at target, just a little bit below. 5.6% is 20% below target, pretty common methodology. We came at the 6.1% at threshold because at some time or another there was some conversation around, over the next 5 to 10 years that this would be the expected return over the next 5 to 10 years. So there's three options to think about. Option A is certainly consistent with the direction that the committee gave us last time, and that's the primary recommendation. But we also provide options B and C just as a reference point for what typical market practice is within the context of a long-term performance plan.
All right, thank you. I do. Ms. Ortega.
So can I just ask first a clarifying question? The long-term incentive that's proposed, let's just look at option A, is fully on top of the existing incentive program that we have in place.
It is.
And there's no proposed reduction or offset of any type to our existing incentive programs. Is that correct?
No. I mean, there was some movement in the ranges, but in terms of incentive opportunity where, I think it was taken down a little bit for some while it went up for others just based on consolidation. Okay. But for the most part, there is some addition here. It also, and the additions would really come in from the standpoint that the philosophy is 50th percentile total cash compensation. These long-term incentive opportunities, in some respects, outside of wanting the balance between annual and long-term performance, it also relates back to the fact that this is what would get you to 50th percentile total cash compensation.
That was sort of my second question is, are we trying to solve a problem of providing incentive for long-term performance, or are we trying to solve a problem of we don't think our cash incentive compensation is high enough? Because those are potentially two separate paths you could go down depending on the problem definition.
That's right, and it's actually intended to address both. One, from the standpoint that it is good to always have a balance between annual and long-term performance, recognizing there's no perfect incentive plan, but you don't want folks sacrificing for the short term, for the long term, in the event of short term. The other element is just, we've been working through this for about 4 years. It really comes back to the competitive market and not being fully competitive with industry, but getting pay consistent with at least the cash compensation offered. as in terms of being in the middle of the market. So.
Well, I think for the board, I am compelled by the argument that we should be doing more to incentivize the long-term view and the long-term approach. I am still skeptical of the need to increase the overall incentive compensation, and I have not still seen enough evidence of the problem of recruitment and retention to be compelled to layer this on top of an existing incentive plan that we already have in place.
Right. Do I have any other commentary? Because we have an action item in front of us. Ms. Oliveras.
I wanted to get just some more clarification. So it seems as though these are performance hurdles. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. So 50% is the first hurdle. That's option A. Option B is the second hurdle. That's 80%. And option C is the third hurdle at 87%. Is that right?
No. Actually, that's a good point. No. Option A is simply that target. And there really is no threshold. You either get to 7% or there's nothing. There's nothing. Option B and C are, and we use this to put in perspective, which is to say that, the plan as proposed and as considered by the committee last time we spoke, it's actually a little bit more difficult there isn't as much flexibility, relative to industry, in that you have to achieve the expected return. There's no award for, modestly, missing the target or the expectations.
Okay, so I guess the other reading of it then, which hopefully I'm getting this right, is that then you get your payout even if you're not reaching the threshold, right?
No, there is, actually another way to say it is that...
even if we don't reach the 7%, you still get paid.
No, you get 0. If under option
B,
under option B, you would have to get to 80% of target, so you would miss the 7% target.
In order to get that additional pay.
Right. Anything below 5%, 5.6%, you get nothing. Option C, anything below 6.1%, you'd get nothing.
Does that create any perverse incentives as you're almost close to hitting that 7%? There might be that negative incentive where you don't want to try that much harder.
Well, that is actually why, most organizations, again, recognizing that goal setting can be an art form. And that is why, more often than not, there is a little bit of room underneath target, just to make sure that there's always a realistic possibility of earning an award and creating thresholds that are, kind of these minimum expectations of acceptable performance. So.
And one thing to add too is that performance between, under B and C, performance between threshold and target would be interpolated. So if you fall between 5.6% and 7% in option B, you would get an amount between 50% and 100% of your payout. So there is some incremental payout for incremental performance above threshold, and likewise between target and maximum as well. Whereas under option A, any incremental, there's kind of that 0 or nothing, or 0 to 100% of payout could cause, and it has potential to cause, a chance for excessive risk taking. Let's say in year 5, if you're close to that, let's say you're at 6.8% or something like that, and you might take additional risks to get above 7% to get your payout. Whereas under the other models, there is an opportunity to get some payout for that getting close, and maybe that would mitigate some excessive risk taking.
So I'm aware of those risk-taking controls, particularly when trading, but I think the incentive structure is different here, right? There's no incentive to churn a client's account or churn a portfolio by continuing to sell securities or doing something like that. So I would imagine we have other risk controls in place, correct? So it's not that just this structure would prevent those other risks from being taken.
Sure, this would not be a one side, there would be multiple avenues to control risk for sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I think I expressed my concern about implementing performance option other than A, because if we have a target investment return, that should be the target. I don't think we should be incentivizing compensation program that's less than the target, because you could, I think, reach a false conclusion. So therefore, from my point of view, I don't think B or C is an option from my vote anyway. The other question, I would like to drill down a little bit on Mrs. Ortega's question. Are you saying that the long term would, if we have 7.2, 7.3 over the next 4 or 5 years, they will be getting incentive on that, plus they will be banking another 7.2 going forward to receive that after 5 years?
There would be overlapping cycles, but I mean, each one is, each performance award is based on, CAGR over a 5-year period. So, so year 1 through 5 would be a performance cycle, year 2 through 6 would be a performance cycle. And so, and that's, by intention, I mean, recognizing that it always trues up the incentive. There's always the potential for, it results in, continual cycles and continual focus on the long term.
So it's aggregated for the first 5 years?
That's right.
Okay, so then if during that period there's a negative, does that reduce that incentive in the 5th year?
If they don't, so, I mean, I think what I'd say is if CAGR is at, 7.2% on, over the 5-year period, they would receive an award a little bit above target. If it's 6.9%, you don't get anything.
Okay, but so it's aggregated, so it would take into consideration negative returns?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to highlight Doug Hoffner, CalPERS team member, on later on the slide deck under option A, there's an illustrative example that plays, I think, to Mr. Jones's comment. It doesn't go negative, but it goes to several scenarios where under a 5% return or 2% return. So you can see how that plays out over time and what the payout in that case would be 0. So that would be maybe helpful for that conversation.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. Ms. Middleton.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly what we're dealing with here. This is long-term performance, and it's being measured over the course of 5 years.
Correct.
So, is there any payout in the first 5 years, or do we wait 5 years to see what the final results are going to be?
You wait 5 years.
All right. In the universe of individuals that this applies to, it's simply the positions that are identified on page 11, or is there anyone else?
It is currently, it's focused on the investment office in general. So
as a whole, all 300 individuals?
The positions, as indicated.
Yeah. So to your point, Ms. Middleton, it's these positions here. It does not include the chief investment officer that is identified on slide 37. This was proposed previously, so that position is not identified here. These are the management investment positions in the organization.
So this is going to apply to a very small universe of people?
Initially, yes.
We're contemplating expanding this model on to other individuals, is that correct?
So what the board has authority for in related to compensation and incentive and base salaries covers the investment management positions, and then other positions within the executive compensation program. What is proposed today is only in the investment office and the investment manager positions. It doesn't cover the other positions. The investment officers 1, 2, or 3 are not identified here, and it doesn't cover positions outside the investment office that the board has authority to set compensation or salary ranges for, strictly for investment.
And a little more broadly, is this a program that is important to Mr. Ming's concept of one team, one fund as we're moving forward to try to move our incentive programs much more to fund total return?
Yes.
All right. Okay. I understand the concept, and I do want to support that, but I'm also inclined to agree with President Jones. The 7% target isn't an artful term that we have here. And I can appreciate it in other contexts, but here, that 7% goal is something that we've identified, and it is a clear and important criteria for employers. So I think the 7% actually has a relevance here that is critical.
I see Mr. Junkin. Go ahead.
Thank you. Had a couple of comments that I wanted to make, but one was just in relation to that last question about sort of the cultural impact of this plan on the investment office.
Right.
You'll recall over the last couple of months at the investment committee, we presented asset class reviews, and we scored, among other things, the organization. And every year we end up dinging you when we compare you to a private sector organization because you can't offer employee ownership. And that is the market in which you compete for talent. So really, this is kind of in our view, a substitute for some of the employee ownership that you could have, whether it's an ESOP or a profit sharing plan or a long-term stock option plan. Similar. I think this page makes it really clear that this is, you have to earn your way into the long-term plan, right? You have to make the initial 5-year return to make the initial award.
Right.
And then it's almost a nested if-then statement, right? If you earn the first one, then you have to earn it again for the next 5 years. I wanted to address Ms. Oliveira's comment about risk controls. I would say the biggest governing risk control here is that the total fund has a tracking error budget of 1.5% versus the strategic asset allocation. So, and only half of that, or 75 basis points, can come from asset allocation misweights. So if staff really, if I would not accuse anyone of doing this, but if you were very close to 7 and someone thought, if we can just juice up the returns a little bit, A, you'd have to call the markets right, and B, you could only swing the portfolio a little bit in terms of overweighting or underweighting equities, which is really what you'd have to get that call right. And I just think that would be an impossible thing. And then last on, I certainly understand the rationale behind the 7%. What page is this? Option A, B, and C on. Thank you, 12. It's important to note that the 7% is a very long-term actuarial return. Your expected returns over the next 10 years are less. That's the 6.1%. So the 7% is already sort of a stretch goal. I'm not arguing for one way or the other. I'm just noting that that's really, if you hit 7% over a 5-year window, I would argue that's probably a top quartile 5-year return based on your asset allocation. I don't know whether I helped or I just confused things, but I thought it was important to comment on those.
Anything else, Ms. Middleton? Okay. Ms. Paquin?
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question. Will the new deputy CIO positions be part of the long-term incentive program as well?
Oh,
okay, so even though they're not listed in the presentation, that is the intent to put them in as well.
Yes, and our recommendations are really, because there is a bigger issue, and it is consistent with this whole concept of one CalPERS. Recommendations, of course, are deal with an investment office as it now stands. Our recommendation also, though, would be, at some point to deliberate, should the CIO participate in the long-term incentive plan? And my recommendation would be yes. Should other executives outside of the investment office participate in a long-term incentive plan? And I'd say yes. Now, on the non-investment folks, there's different things that you can do to kind of recognizing that they're not necessarily managing the funds on a day-to-day basis, but there are some other things that you could build into it. So, we're believers in long-term incentives for leadership because it forces the balance between long-term reward and, annual operating performance. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of our perspective, is that over time, you'll just have to consider whether or not it makes sense to expand to the rest of the organization. So.
Okay, thank you. And let's have a comment. I agree with Mr. Jones' comments about option A. I think that since we are not using this to supplant any of the current incentive bonus awards that investment staff are eligible for, that it makes sense to tie this to the discount rate, since that is what everything else is based on. Thank you.
And just as your consultants, I mean, we support that wholeheartedly. So.
Okay. Ms. Oliveris.
Just one last comment. Again, when we talk about the one CalPERS culture, and Ms. Middleton talked about this, I'm concerned that as we have another incentive program tied on top of another, and we have some investment officers that aren't eligible for anything, it just might create more division and less alignment within the culture. So just something to think about.
No, and that certainly is something that we're reflective of. I do think it's great to start out with the investment office as it now stands, because again, part of it is the competitive gap. The other part is just basic behavior and incentive for performance, and we're trying to blend those two together. But the one thing I'll say is that, and this will be a discussion for a later date, is we do have a recommendation later that maybe you should consider. Certainly the CIO and potentially more members of the leadership team to participate in the long-term incentive plan.
Doug Hoffner, CalPERS team. I just want to clarify one of the comments that Ms. Oliveros made. So there's some positions in the investment office that we don't have direct control over their salary setting authority. So that's something that's bargained with the state of California. They've just gone through that process, and they're literally in ratification process right now, I think, for the next 10 days, 12 days or something like that. So there's some that there's always going to be a potential misalignment where the board and authority vested within the organization doesn't have that control, but to the degree those can be aligned. I hear what you're saying, and just there's some of the stuff we just beyond our control.
Okay. Ms. Ortega?
Yeah, and I think that misalignment goes to my earlier comment, which is across state government more broadly, we would expect we would look for a higher bar in terms of when we would add additional compensation on top of the existing structure. We would look for higher rates of vacancy, higher turnover rates, more problems than I think we've seen to date. And I think the other point, in the answer to Ms. Paquin's question about the new position being added to the list as well. And I think based on some of the discussion that occurred after that comment, it seems clear that this is opening the door to a lot of potential future conversation about other positions being added to the long-term incentive. So again, my biggest concern is not unlike my concern about the new position itself, is that we look to, we identify a problem and we look to layer on a solution on top of what we already have, but we're not looking at taking anything out of it. We just add on top of, and that sort of it doesn't work across all compensation structures in state government, and so it gives me a pause to approve it here.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more commentary, but I will say I know that our CEO can't say anything on this, but could you, for our newer employees, so we have, Doug, if you could kind of go into, because it was real confusing when we were doing this earlier, kind of go into the base pay, the incentive, and then the long-term incentive, just kind of how that works.
So how this would work under the proposal here?
Yeah.
So there's base salaries, which in this case, the board has already approved. That was done most recently in February, the most recent changes to the salary compensation structure within the investment office. There are targets for performance, or quantitative and qualitative, really tied to the total fund. So that's kind of going to that alignment of the total interests of this organization, that the total fund is what we're looking to make sure we grow. Then you have so as base, you have incentive targets. The ranges have moved up and down depending on which positions and classes you are in the investment office, but they could range from 0 to 75% of your base salary. Some are at 0 to 60 or 50. again, tied to the specific work that you're doing, and then how did you perform against that quantitative and qualitatively, which was presented in closed session. In addition to this, if that was to be in effect, the long-term piece would come into play, whereby beginning whatever the effective date would be, you'd have this new 5-year window where you might have the opportunity, if you perform, hitting, let's say, option A, the 7%, if you hit that or higher, you would then be eligible for that increase over that 5-year period as well. So you get base pay each year. Depending on how you perform on an annual incentive, you would get some of that depending on performance. And then this is the opportunity, and this is strictly total fund. So how well did we hit it or not? It's it's all or nothing in some respects, right? It's like to the example was on slide, I think 23 or so. Whatever the return looks like over that 5-year window is what the payouts would then be. And if you don't hit it, you don't get paid, which you've already gotten base, and you've probably gotten some annual incentive over that 5-year window as well.
And I just will tell the new folks that we've been working on this for a while. And I think we all kind of came to the agreement that we needed something, because that is something that keeps us from hiring good talent on one hand. But I will say, I think we also all agreed on that we wanted to see, if we have to hit 7%, we wanted to see 7%. I could be wrong, so if anybody thinks I'm wrong on that, that was where I understood it. But at this point, since we have no additional commentary, we are kind of in a vote situation here. So I need a motion on one of these 3 options.
Move option A.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Fechner has moved option A. Ms. Middleton has seconded it. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. No? Okay. One no, 1 abstain. Ms. Ortega, Ms. Oliveras abstain. All right. And the agenda item carries. Thank you. All right. It looks like we are in summary of committee direction.
So I have, I think, one item that I kind of combined between the various comments I heard was the board would like to see a draft org chart for the DCIO role, vacant positions to be used as related to that role, and then roles and responsibilities of that position. I think that covers it.
And can I add one thing? I think that I'd like to see us do a comparison. I know we've done it before, of the CEO's pay with like pension systems, because I feel like we are not gender aligned. So if we could do that for whenever our next PCTM meeting is.
Let me just maybe clarify the point on that. So what I would recommend, if sort of asking for the data, that we align it with and I'm trying to find it in the policy here, the peer group we've already identified and the committee and the board has approved as tumors our peer group in terms of compensation for these investment and other executive management positions. We've already identified that peer group. So
have we brought it forward to the board?
Yes, but I'm saying we can get that data. When you just say our like peers, I want to make sure we're clarifying that it's consistent with the group and body identified in the overall policy that's in the board approved. That's
yes.
All. Okay.
Yes.
That's all. I just want to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Anybody? Mr. Gonzaga, did you have something you're?
Oh no, I was
okay.
I was just going to say that as part of that review. It's this whole concept of just when the time is right to consider who should the long-term incentive plan apply to. Again, thinking about one CalPERS. So.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So at this point, we're going to move on to public comment. Oh, I'm sorry, Stacy.
I'd like to know who the peer group is.
It's in policy. Hold on a sec.
Okay. So it's leading U.S. public funds.
I'm sorry.
Microphone to you. There you go.
Tina Campbell, CalPERS team. Leading U.S. public funds, leading Canadian public funds.
Oh, I'm sorry. He's leading U.S. public funds? Okay.
Leading Canadian public funds.
Uh-huh.
Select California-based agencies. including large local agencies, banks, and insurance companies. And it's on page 6 of our policy.
I don't think the monetary list is on page 6, though, right?
Are you talking, what was?
Looking at monetary comparison. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, so that's the group we've used before.
Yes.
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 And that's just for the executive management positions. We've used that. Grant Thornton's presented and provided that historically to this body in the last couple of years. We'll update the material and bring that back to you with those key identified areas. So we're using apples to apples comparisons.
And when we get that list, will those names of will the entity names be listed?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's public information, most of it, isn't it?
Yeah, so we'll...
Just not the private ones. We
Some
can't
of them
list
are in
them.
SEC disclosures.
Yeah, so we've used various consulting groups to help bring that executive data. So from other firms, so yeah.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. Okay, I'm on to public comment, and that is Mr. Johnson. Can you come on down? Grab a microphone over here on my left, your right.
Neil Johnson, SEIU Local 1000. As was mentioned by Mr. Hoffner, we recently completed a collective bargaining agreement with Ms. Ortega's and the administration. In that process, we had proposed to increase the compensation of the investment officers that work for PERS, STRS, Department of Insurance, Earthquake Authority. I think there's one other that we did not succeed in that, but we got a counter proposal that increased the bonus structure or bonus percentage of the investment officer 3s and added the investment officer 2s into the concept of a performance-based compensation. We had, back in the Schwarzenegger administration, proposed bringing the 2s into the incentive program, and that was not entertained at that time. But I do want to thank the administration for their thoughtfulness on this issue, and Mr. Hoffner and I have agreed that we'll sit down in a couple of weeks after our members have hopefully ratified the agreement and discuss some of the specifics, because the proposal we got came at essentially the stroke of midnight. Ms. Ortega was outside the state caucus room writing, I think, her speech. At the time, we had some questions about some of the specifics of the proposals, so we're going to sit down and, not that I particularly see problems, but like to address the issues beforehand. So, we have, besides the our managers, the investment officers, the rank and file people are also in the incentive-based compensation. Taking a moment of personal privilege, I'd like to thank Ms. Ortega and the administration for what I think was a very thoughtful approach to bargaining. Clearly our members are not going to like the overall general salary increase, but it's a contract no one went backwards in, and they really realized that the people who were at minimum wage or below what will be the $15 threshold should be brought up and brought now, and I thank them for that, doing that, and also to recognize that compensation in certain areas where there are a large number of vacancies and lower paid employees, particularly thinking of Santa Cruz, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara counties, and with low-paying employees, many of which work part-time bases and getting a salary increase. And so I really thank you for your thoughtfulness, and it was never bargaining's never enjoyable. It's a drag, but I think we got, to quote the Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want, but if you try, you get what you need.
Thank you. All right. So seeing no further comments, this meeting is adjourned, and governance, 3:35. Governance will start at 3:35.